Was Ayesha Hazarika, political commentator, columnist, and someone who had spent enough time both inside and outside Britain's media and political circles to recognize the difference between fair criticism and a smear campaign. Opposite her sat Piers Morgan, a man who had by this point transformed himself from a once tabloid editor into a kind of professional antagonist, someone whose brand rested entirely on finding a target, hammering them endlessly, and insisting that he was simply telling it like it is. But on this morning, the target wasn't just Meghan Markle. It wasn't even just Harry and Meghan together. The target was the very idea that systemic prejudice existed within Britain's media at all, and Morgan was there to knock it down before it could gain ground. From the moment the cameras rolled, the tone was set. Piers leaned back with the air of someone entirely confident he would win the exchange, his expression fixed in that half-smile that usually meant he was about to launch a barrage of gotcha lines. For months, he had been relentlessly hammering the same theme in print, on television, and across social media. Meghan Markle was a thin-skinned, manipulative figure who couldn't handle even the mildest press scrutiny, and who, in his view, played the race card whenever it suited her. It was a line that played well with certain sections of the British public, particularly those already primed to distrust or dislike the Duchess of Sussex. But Ayesha had come armed with more than talking points. She had evidence, historical context, and the ability to weave those into a clear and uncompromising argument. Her opening remarks were calm but devastating. Meghan's treatment by the press wasn't a matter of her personal sensitivity. It was part of a recognizable pattern in which women of color in high-profile spaces are subjected to harsher, more invasive, and more demeaning coverage than their white counterparts. The examples Ayesha brought to the table were not abstract, and that's what made them so potent. She reminded viewers that the honeymoon period, those first few months where Meghan was celebrated as a glamorous new royal, had evaporated almost overnight. The same newspapers that once ran glowing front pages now twisted the most innocuous actions into scandal. She pointed to the now infamous avocado comparison. Kate Middleton eats avocado during pregnancy, and the story is framed as wholesome, nurturing, and health-conscious. Meghan eats avocado during pregnancy, and suddenly the fruit is tied to environmental destruction and, human rights abuses abroad. Kate cradles her bump, and its maternal grace. Meghan cradles hers, and its virtue signaling and attention-seeking. Then there was the early reference to Meghan's mother's neighborhood as straight outta Compton, a phrase so drenched in racial stereotyping that it could not have been written innocently. These weren't one-off oddities. They were part of an ongoing drip feed of coded negativity, which, over time, really shaped how Meghan was perceived by the public. Piers' counter was, basically, to ignore the systemic nature of what Ayesha was describing. Instead, he went for the well-worn greatest hits of his anti-Sussex campaign. Meghan, he said, was guilty of hypocrisy, lecturing the public about climate change while taking private jets, demanding privacy while courting media attention, accepting the privileges of royal life while trying to dodge the duties. He fell back, inevitably, on his personal ghosting anecdote, the claim that Meghan had cut him off after they had once met for drinks. To most reasonable observers, this would be irrelevant to a discussion about media fairness, but for Piers, it seemed to be the origin point of his hostility. This personal bitterness bled into every sentence he spoke about her, even when he tried to frame it as objective commentary. Ayesha, however, wasn't having it. She refused to let the discussion spiral into petty grievances. Her focus remained on the press's disproportionate hostility and the way it mirrored long-standing patterns of how women of color are targeted in public life. As the conversation deepened, the differences in their approach became almost archetypal. Ayesha spoke in terms of patterns, histories, and social realities, of how coded language works, how stereotypes take root, and how public opinion is shaped not just by what's reported, but by how it's reported. Piers stuck to anecdotes, selective examples, and blanket denials that racism played any part in Meghan's coverage. He demanded proof while ignoring the mountain of it in plain sight. It was the same frustrating dynamic many people of color experience in these conversations, being asked to provide evidence to someone who has no genuine intention of accepting it, because to acknowledge it would require admitting complicity in the very system being criticized. The exchange also laid bare something else: how personal ego and media power intertwine. Piers wasn't just defending the press in some abstract sense, he was defending himself. His own coverage, his own opinions, his own role in fueling the hostility. To admit that bias existed in the coverage of Meghan would be to admit that his own relentless attacks had been part of that bias. For someone who thrives on the image of being unapologetically right, that kind of self-reflection was never going to happen on live television. Ayesha's composure in the face of his interruptions and attempts to derail the discussion was telling. She refused to be baited into a shouting match, instead repeatedly steering the conversation back to the evidence, the headlines, the contrasts, the racially loaded framing that so many pretended not to notice. By the time the segment ended, nothing had been resolved, but much had been revealed. Viewers had seen in real time the clash between someone trying to have an honest, nuanced conversation about systemic bias and someone determined to shut that conversation down. It wasn't just a debate about Harry and Meghan anymore. It was about the media's role in shaping public opinion, about the invisibility of prejudice to those who benefit from it, and about how hard it is to break through the defensive wall of denial that surrounds powerful broadcasters. The viral clips that followed online told their own story. Some cheered Piers for standing up to what they saw as identity politics, but others saw exactly what Ayesha was pointing out, that his hostility had less to do with principle and far more to do with a personal vendetta that had metastasized into a public crusade. In the end, the significance of that morning wasn't in whether one side won the argument. It was in the fact that Ayesha refused to cede the ground, refused to let the conversation be dragged down into gossip and petty score settling. She showed that even in a space dominated by personalities like Piers, it is possible to challenge the narrative, to call out the double standards, and to name the prejudice, even if the other person will spend the entire segment pretending it doesn't exist. For the Sussexes, watching from afar, it must have been yet another reminder that this was never just about unfair headlines. It was about a media ecosystem, and the individuals who drive it, that will twist itself into knots to avoid admitting its own bias, even as that bias plays out in black and white on its own front pages.